In this video, we talk about why the 5 years before retirement are so important. What does that look like in your investment portfolio and how that ties into maybe wanting to pay off some big expenses going into retirement, planning for healthcare costs that are continuing to rise, and then being able to envision what your retirement looks like. Stay tuned. Everyone understands that once you get to retirement, you really want to know how much money you have going into it so you can make the right decisions, feel comfortable retiring. But what a lot of people don't consider is how important the 5 years leading up to retirement are. So today we're going to talk through the importance of those 5 years and some things you should be looking at and looking forward to. We'll start. Not only does the 5 years leading up to retirement matter, that is a part of a 10-year critical period, which factors the first 5 years in retirement. Why are the 5 years leading up to and the first 5 years into retirement so important?
Yeah. So it is called the 10-year critical period, right? It's the 5 years before you retire and the first 5 years after you retire. And the reason is that it is when your investment portfolio is most vulnerable. So if you have you're accumulating, let's say you're retiring at age 60 and you're accumulating from 55 to 60, we really can't afford to have bad investment return years. So there's a lot of studies around something called the sequence of return risk. And it says that you can have a good overall investment return for retirement. But if in the first 5 years, the market dips or you have big corrections or your portfolio goes significantly backwards, it can set you back 10 years of saving. And you don't really have time to watch it recover before you have to walk away or before because you're drawing from those dollars. So the reason the 5 years before retirement are important, if you see a significant drawdown in your investment portfolio, it can push out when you can retire, right? You might not be able to retire until age 63, 65. And so one of the things that we do is we really want to de-escalate the risk in your portfolio going into that 5-year period. And even though we might be in retirement with a higher stock portfolio when we're in our 70s and 80s because we can afford to, that moment 5 years before and 5 years after, we're coming down. A lot of times we're coming down all the way to 50% stock, 50% bonds in the portfolio. Yes, we might not capture some of the upside market growth in those years, but it really pays off to not capture the downside of having a bad few years in your investment portfolio. So the number one thing in that 5 years leading up to retirement is we want to come down on your portfolio risk.
How does understanding your retirement costs within the 5 years leading up to retirement play a role?
Yeah. The retirement costs, a lot of things that you'll read will say, when you retire, you won't spend so much money, right? They say, hey, you're living in working years, you're earning, you're spending, but when you get retired, you won't spend that much money. And the data says that's not true, right? I have another advisor, her name's Angie Rubufo. She's awesome. And she says to her clients, when you retire, you go from a normal 7 days of the week to 6 Saturdays and a Sunday, right? That whatever, most people spend a lot of money on Saturday, right? They have their time, right? They go to lunch, they might eat out, they might go to a movie, they might do different things, right? With their friends or events on weekends because they have the time to do it. And when you retire, a lot of times, specifically for the first phase, a lot of times they divide retirement into 3 different phases. So the first phase is the go-go phase, right? You are going, you have your health, you have your wellness, you have money, and you have time. And those are actually sometimes more expensive years than the last working years that you had. So we need to understand what your ideal lifestyle is, how much eating out and travel and time with family you're planning on spending so that we can really nail your retirement budget. Because if we underestimate how much you're spending, or if you overspend the budget, it really causes folks to have to significantly pull back in later years or go back to work. And if that's not the goal and that's not the dream, then we need to really be able to nail your retirement costs going into retirement. So that includes housing, That includes healthcare. That includes eating. That includes prescriptions, insurance premiums, everything. We really want to understand what you're going to be spending. And then we want to build in some buffer, right? We want to build in the fact that life happens and, house maintenance happens and, illnesses happen. And you might be needing to help children or grandchildren or different things that you want to do there. So we really want to take into account all of the retirement costs so that we can nail your retirement number. And when we transition into retirement, we can make sure that you stay retired.
It can be tricky. It can be tricky to go from a traditional week to a week that consists of 6 Saturdays and a Sunday. So thinking through that from the understanding of trying to understand costs and expenses, how do you plan for that?
Yeah, we have to put parameters around the areas in which you may tend to overspend, right? So this is person to person. There are some folks who, when they're bored, they shop, or when they have extra time on their hands, they go to Home Depot and they're fixing up around the house, and everything they look at around the house is a new project that needs a new saw and a new fixture and new wood and new material. And so we need to understand, like, what are your problem areas? Is it shopping? Is it travel? Is it home repair? Is it kids? Is it grandkids? Is it eating out, right? Is it concerts? And so we need to understand what are the areas that you are tempted to really blow your spending plan out of the water. And then we need to put some hard parameters around what you can afford in those areas. And I think it's beautiful when we say this is important. It needs to be there. Travel is important. So let's make sure that we have a healthy budget for it. But once we've built the healthy budget, we then have to be mindful of not overextending ourselves because our future selves will really pay the price for it.
And it is a big focus with spending and cost and having a plan. Like, it is a big focus in general to set parameters, right? I mean, that is the essential idea of a budget. But as we're thinking through budgeting or having a plan for some of our day-to-day, month-to-month, week-to-week cost, what are some ideas that we want to keep in mind when we're thinking about big expenses and paying for big expenses and how to handle those within the last 5 years going into retirement?
Yeah, I think that big expenses specifically. So when we think about mortgages, right, that's one of the big ones. If we have people who say, I want to go into retirement without a mortgage, I think that's completely noble. We have clients who do that. And so we want to say, okay, let's put a plan together for what that looks like. What would it look like for you to, in the next 5 years, pay off the mortgage? Or what would it look like in the next 5 years? Some folks still have student loan debt, or maybe they've helped their children with student loan debt. So they might have a parent plus student loan. What would it look like for us to completely wipe those dollars out? Tax bills. We might say we're hoping to save and relocate, right? So if we wanted to be able to sell our home, have money saved, and buy another home cash in another location, or just downsize to a condo instead of our mortgage that we raised our family in, right? So we want to really figure out what would that look like. We can run the numbers to see, in this new lifestyle, without these debts or without this big expense or without these things that we're responsible for, this is the cash flow that works for you. And if we really like what life would look like without a mortgage or without that debt, then we've got 5 years, 4 years, however much time we have to really intentionally save and pay down those debts. And it can be a very freeing experience going into retirement with very low debt. But it means that we have to tighten our belt for the last 4 or 5 years. And so, I'm a big proponent of getting out of debt or going into retirement with as little debt as possible and as little additional obligations as possible. So, we've got to make a plan for it and then execute that plan.
Planning to pay off the big expenses going into retirement is key. And it does take some planning and some strategy and some intentionality to it. And so going into retirement without some of the bigger expenses, mortgage, auto loans, student loans, et cetera, and sometimes having to replace them with healthcare expenses. How can we prepare for that with the 5 years leading into retirement?
Yeah. I think about healthcare in three different arenas. The first one is Medicare. When we think about Medicare planning, you have to enroll in Medicare at age 65. There's a penalty if you don't. Medicare is a very well-run health insurance system, and you do have some options if you are still working full-time past 65 that you can keep your company-sponsored plan. But once you leave that company and transition, you have to sign up for Medicare. So we think about Medicare, we think about the premiums, how healthy are you, right? How much are we expecting to be able to, the premiums will be the same, but how much will we need to pay for prescription plans or other outside specialty healthcare items? And so that's the second part, right? So the first part is just Medicare. Do we need Medicare? Do we need a supplemental plan? Do we need a prescription plan? But the second one is, what medications and what specialists are you a part of? So if we know that we are on multiple medications, if we know that we have to see a heart specialist, or that we're recovering from a cancer scare, or we're recovering from different things, then we need to be prepared to buy better plans in the supplemental space. And we need to budget for the cost of prescriptions. And that can be a lot. And so, the current average, when we look at healthcare expenses for a couple, the current averages for a couple run around $12,000 out of pocket. So 12 grand out of pocket paying for health costs is the average, which means that, that's the 50% mark. So there's some folks getting away with 6 grand, and there's some folks paying 25,000 per year after taxes on health care costs in retirement. And so that's the second place. First is just the premium and the insurance, but the second one are the prescriptions and the specialists. And then the third one is long-term care. We are in prime long-term care need space when we're retired. The average long-term care event happens at age 80, but we've seen early onset dementia. We've seen a lot of different bodily things that break down that cause you to need skilled labor nursing, so a skilled nursing home, or a lot of times people prefer in-home healthcare. And whether or not we're choosing to buy a long-term care policy or not, we need to have a long-term care plan in place. And that means who's caring for you, who's paying for it, and where the dollar's coming from, and making sure that everyone is on the same page around that. So our spouse knows that, our children know that, so that when something happens, there's no disagreements about how we're going to maintain care long-term for either, if it's a couple, for either of the parents, especially for the women of the couple, typically, because they usually outlive the male, and they usually live a lot longer without spousal support to care for them. So that's really a conversation we want to have with retiring women.
Yeah. And healthcare can be expensive. It is becoming more expensive because a lot of people are having to rely on skilled labor, which is in fact increasing the cost of it.
Yeah.
And so being able to and having to envision, right, what your retirement days or years will look like. How long do I plan to live? How will I live? And factoring how healthcare plays a part into that. How does making sure that you take the time to envision what your retirement lifestyle will be like play into the last 5 years before you retire?
Yeah. The highest indicator of fulfillment for retirees is the quality of the relationships. Those relationships include spouses, but more importantly, they really include friendships. And so for a lot of corporate working, retiring folks, their work family or their work colleagues are really tied into who they spend a lot of their time with. They're their closest friends, the friends that they spend, They might hang out on weekends. They might do nights. They've built a community inside of those organizations. And when you retire, a lot of folks lose that. And it can be very important in the 5 years leading up to retirement that you are intentional about maintaining the relationships that you have, but also building other relationships with people who are going to be retired as well, right? If you're retired and all of your closest friends are still working, that's a tough deal to really build relationship with. So we're really thinking about community organizations. So nonprofits, nonprofit board service, nonprofit volunteering, community organizations, fraternity and sororities, if you're a part of it, church family, all of those areas are really good for you to build relationships in a space that has time and capacity and could actually use the help. And then that relates to the second part, which is how do you impact the world now, right? For a lot of folks that they've been dedicated to what they do, they've been needed, they've been necessary, they're skilled. It gives them fulfillment, and that all goes away in some cases if you just decide to go fishing or to travel or to really live a life of leisure in retirement. So one, we want to make sure that you're maintaining the relationships, but two, we want to make sure that we're maintaining your sense of fulfillment. And that's another place where nonprofits can be really, really helpful. Or if you're still consulting in some way, if you have an expertise that you can continue to consult short term or in the first few years of retirement to make sure that you're still sharp and learning and growing and connecting with people. So just really thinking about what is your ideal retirement? Who are you spending it with? What are the activities that you're spending it doing? And what is the purpose that you're still finding while you retire can really help you to envision a retirement that keeps you growing and thriving long term.
That's important. And so being able to understand and envision what this next phase of life will look like plays well into having to understand the cost, right? Understanding that there is a 10-year critical period, first 5 years of retirement, and understanding any changes that you should make from a portfolio perspective within that last 5 years plays into retirement. Wanting to get out of some big expenses so that you really don't have to worry about those going into retirement.
Mm-hmm.
Healthcare playing a big part of retirement nowadays. So being sure to prepare and plan for that. And if you are in the last 5 years going into retirement, this all makes a lot of sense of things you should be thinking about. But for those that aren't necessarily at this phase, 30s, 40s, 50s, and you want to get a better understanding of where your money should be, how much you should have saved, what are some things you should be thinking about as it relates to retirement, check out this next video and we'll be able to answer some of your questions and give you some clarity as to where you should be.